General audience number 117 of July 4th, 1984. This first half was not delivered for the sensitivity of its content. When the language of the liturgy becomes the language of the body. Let us return to the classical 5th chapter of Ephesians. This text is, besides, always present in our considerations of marriage as a sacrament, in the first place, and above all in the dimension of the covenant and of grace. We should consider this text again in the treatment of the dimension of the sacramental sign. Like the texts of the prophets, Tobit obviously makes use of references to the Old Covenant, above all, however, of references to the original covenant, to the beginning, with which marriage is united as the primordial sacrament. Ephesians reveals the eternal sources of the covenant in the love of the Father and, at the same time, its new and definitive institution in Jesus Christ. This connection explains the sacramentality of marriage to the disciples and followers of Christ who participate in the new covenant. See especially Ephesians chapter 3, verse 6. This obviously refers to marriage also in the dimension of the sacramental sign. Also from this point of view, the words of the classical text of Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 21 to 33, seem very eloquent. We have already shown this indirectly in the earlier analyses of this text. Still, now we should again consider it exclusively under the aspect of the sacramental sign of marriage. Be subject to one another in the fear of Christ, writes the author of Ephesians. Husbands have the duty to love their wives as their own bodies. For the one who loves his wife loves himself. No one, in fact, ever hates his own flesh, but he nourishes and cares for it, as Christ does with the church. Therefore, also you, each one on his part, should love his wife as himself, and the woman should have reverence toward her husband. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 to 29 and 33. If the sign of marriage as a sacrament is built on the basis of the language of the body reread in the truth of love, Ephesians is certainly a stupendous expression of it. One can say definitive. In this letter, we find also in this respect the traditions of the prophets of the Old Covenant, and in addition, the echo of the Song of Songs. The short passage from Ephesians does not, as does the Song of Songs, contain the language of the body in all the richness of its subjective meaning. One can say that it contains the objective confirmation of this language in its entirety, a solid and complete confirmation. The words of the author of Ephesians seems to be above all a commentary on those older original biblical words in which the nature of the sacramental sign of marriage finds its expression. The two will be one flesh. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. This commentary is personalistic in the full meaning of the word, which was already shown in the earlier analyses of this text. The language of the liturgy is equally personalistic, both when we consider Tobit and when we consider the present liturgy of the church. Tobit says, quote, "I take this sister of mine, grant that she and I may find mercy." Tobit chapter 8, verse 7. The present liturgy of the Latin Church has the new spouses say, quote, "I take you as my wife, as my husband. I promise to be true to you. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life." From the commentary of Ephesians, it is clear that the language of masculinity and femininity connected with the sign of unity of the flesh must be understood in a fully personalistic way. It is sufficient to recall briefly what was already established about the text of Ephesians. Quote, "Husbands have the duty to love their wives as their own bodies." Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28. The wife's body is not the husband's body, but should be loved like his own. The unity at issue is not ontological, but moral, a unity through love. Quote, "The one who loves his wife loves himself." Also from verse 28. Love makes the other I, in a certain sense, one's own I. Through love, the wife's I becomes, so to speak, the husband's I. The body is the expression of this I. It is the basis of its identity. The union of husband and wife also expresses itself through the body, through the mutual relationship. Love not only unites the two subjects, but it allows them to penetrate each other so mutually, thereby belonging spiritually to each other, that the author of Ephesians can affirm, quote, "The one who loves his wife loves himself," Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28. The I becomes, in a certain sense, you, and the you becomes I. Marriage as a sacrament in the first place in the dimension of covenant and grace comes from Theology, the Body, Audiences 87 to 107. In this way, the language of the body, precisely with this personalistic commentary of Ephesians, becomes the language of the liturgy, because it is on its basis, on its foundation, that the sacramental sign of marriage is built. The liturgy reveals above all how in this sign, the dimension of the covenant and of grace is realized. In the prayer of Tobias and Sarah, this is evident in the language of the Old Covenant. It is also evident in the rite of the sacrament of marriage, in the manifold richness and differentiation characteristic of the Church's liturgy. This liturgy models itself, for the most part, on Ephesians, its definitive biblical model. In the prism of this model, one can see distinctly and with particular clarity that through the language of the body reread in the truth of love, which is at the same time the integral truth of the person's subjects, the sacramental sign of marriage is built up in the language of the liturgy and the whole liturgical ritual. In the prism of the same text, one also sees the way in which the language and ritual of the liturgy form, or ought to form, the language of the body, as the text authentically inscribed in the conjugal life of man and woman on the level of the communion of persons. They model it through the covenant and grace that the liturgy proclaims and realizes in the sacrament. Is this not shown by the words in which the author of Ephesians explains how husbands must love their wives as their own bodies? And what the Christian style of reciprocal relations and of the shared life of the spouses should be? Do not the words of the letter in the specific context of the personalist commentary on Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 to 25 reveal, so to speak, the absolute sense of this language of the body, which it can reach only in the analogy of the love of Christ with the church? The sacramental sign, mysterium, and ethos. General Audience number 117B of July 4th, 1984. Today we return to the classical text of Ephesians 5, which reveals the eternal sources of the covenant in the Father's love, and at the same time, its new and definitive institution in Jesus Christ. This text brings us to a dimension of the language of the body that could be called mystical. It speaks, in fact, about marriage as a great mystery. This mystery is great. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32. And although this mystery is realized in the spousal union of Christ, the Redeemer, with the church, and of the church as bride with Christ, quote, I say this with reference to Christ and the church, also from verse 32. Although it is definitively realized in the eschatological dimensions, still the author of Ephesians does not hesitate to extend the analogy of Christ's union with the church in spousal love, outlined in such an absolute and eschatological way, to the sacramental sign of the spousal covenant between man and woman, who are subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. He does not hesitate to extend that mystical analogy of the language of the body, reread in the truth of spousal love and of the conjugal union of the two. One must recognize the logic of this wonderful text, which radically frees our way of thinking from Manichaean elements or from a non-personalist way of thinking about the body, and at the same time brings the language of the body, which is contained on the sacramental sign of marriage, closer to the dimension of real holiness. The sacraments infuse holiness into the terrain of man's humanity. They penetrate the soul and the body, the femininity and masculinity of the personal subject, with the power of holiness. All of this is expressed in the language of the liturgy. There it is expressed, and there it is realized. The liturgy, liturgical language, elevates the conjugal covenant of man and woman, which is based on the language of the body reread in the truth, to the dimensions of the mystery, and at the same time enables that covenant to be realized in these dimensions through the language of the body. It is precisely about this that the sign of the sacrament of marriage speaks, which expresses in liturgical language an interpersonal event full of intense personal content, assigned as a task to the two until death. The sacramental sign signifies not only the fieri, coming to be, or birth of marriage, but builds its esse, being, its duration. Both the one and the other is a sacred and sacramental reality rooted in the dimension of the covenant and of grace, in the dimension of creation and redemption. In this way, the liturgical language assigns love, faithfulness, and conjugal integrity to both man and woman through the language of the body. It assigns them the unity and indissolubility of marriage in the language of the body. It assigns them as a task the whole sacrum of the person and of the communion of persons. And in the same way, their masculinity and femininity precisely in this language. In this sense, we affirm that liturgical language becomes the language of the body. This signifies a series of acts and tasks that form the spirituality of marriage, its ethos. In the daily life of the couple, these acts become tasks, and these tasks, acts. These acts, likewise, also the obligations, are by nature spiritual, but they are still at the same time expressed by the language of the body. The author of Ephesians writes in this regard, "Husbands have the duty to love their wives as their own bodies," Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28, as himself from verse 33. And the woman should have reverence toward her husband, also from verse 33. Both, moreover, should be subject to one another in the fear of Christ, chapter 5, verse 21 of Ephesians. The language of the body, as an uninterrupted continuity of liturgical language, expresses itself not only with the reciprocal fascination and pleasure of the Song of Songs, but also as a deep experience of the sacrum that seems to be infused in masculinity and femininity itself through the dimension of mystery, the mysterium magnum of Ephesians, whose roots plunge precisely into the beginning, that is, into the mystery of the creation of man, male and female, in the image of God, called from the beginning to be the visible sign of God's creative love. Thus, that fear of Christ and reverence about which the author of Ephesians speaks is nothing other than a spiritually mature form of that reciprocal fascination. That is to say, of the man for femininity and of the woman for masculinity, which reveals itself for the first time in Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. Later, the same fascination seems to run like a wide torrent through the verses of the Song of Songs, to find under wholly different circumstances its concise and concentrated expression in Tobit. The spiritual maturity of this fascination is nothing but the fruit born of the gift of fear, one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, which St. Paul spoke about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. Besides, Paul's teaching about chastity as life according to the Spirit, see Romans chapter 8, verse 5, allows us, particularly on the basis of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, to interpret that reverence in the charismatic sense, that is, as a gift of the Holy Spirit. By calling on the couple to submit to one another in the fear of Christ, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, and then by stirring their desire for reverence in conjugal relations, Ephesians seems to highlight chastity as a virtue and as a gift, in keeping with the Pauline tradition. In this way, the reciprocal fascination of masculinity and femininity matures spiritually through the virtue and even more so through the gift of life according to the Spirit. Both the man and the woman, provided they turn away from concupiscence, find the proper dimension of the freedom of the gift, united with femininity and masculinity in the true spousal meaning of the body. Thus, liturgical language, that is, the language of the sacrament and of the mystery, becomes in their life and living together the language of the body in a depth, simplicity, and beauty hitherto altogether unknown. This seems to be the integral meaning of the sacramental sign of marriage. In this way, through the language of the body, man and woman encounter the great mysterium in order to transfer the light of this mystery, a light of truth and of beauty expressed in liturgical language, into the language of love, of the body. That is, into the language of the proxies of love, of faithfulness, and of conjugal integrity, or into the ethos rooted in the redemption of the body. On this road, conjugal life in some sense becomes liturgy.